want to welcome you all to this second Q&A of the government's 2023 conference this evening with the Treasury Minister, the man who holds this government's purse strings, Dr. Allinson, who's the MHK for Ramsey. Now, these evening sessions were added this year, following feedback last year that people would have appreciated something that they could come to outside the working day. So that's what we've done. So thanks very much for those of you who are spending your evening with us here. As billed, this is unscripted, no frills, no spin, no pre-prepared answers. We don't know what the questions are. So this is, if you like, raw political engagement in practice. It's your chance to put your questions to the Treasury Minister and air your views. We had plenty of that in the last session with the Chief Minister, which overran by about 20 minutes. So I should say who I am. I'm Marian and I work in the Cabinet Office, and I'm simply here to get things going, warm the thing up and keep it moving along. And to wit, I need to tell you how you can put your questions. So you can do it in one of two ways. You can stand up and vocalize your question in person, or you can scan the QR code on the screen behind me and use the Slido method, which is like an interactive online question box. So rather than writing a question on a piece of paper and handing it in, it's a virtual way of doing the same on a device that you have, and the question will magically appear on the tablet that I have. So when you go, when you do scan it and you go on, just choose Cinema Room. And if you can't get through by using that QR code, please just go to the website, which is behind me, which is slido.com, and use the code IOMGov23. So, Treasury Minister, you've just hot-footed it here from a session on the main stage about education and childcare. Just give us a quick taste of that.
Apologies, I'm running a little bit late. It was about education and childcare. Why am I there? Because of the money, because of the resources, because when you're talking about lifelong learning, you can't do it on the cheap if you want to do it properly. So we were answering a whole range of questions, from the funding costs of Russian high school through to the funding of increasing accessibility and affordability of preschool childcare, which obviously is one of the priorities with the childcare strategy, right the way through to transgender kids and how they're treated in schools and how you do properly age-appropriate sex and relationship education. So it was an interesting session, but in a big hall where you couldn't really see people in the back. So thank you very much for coming here. And yeah, I'll try to be as honest as possible. I'm joined by some of the Treasury team who I hope will do any anonymous question they want through Slido to ask the really difficult ones and catch me out. But hopefully we can have an open discussion about some of the challenges the Isle of Man faces, some of the opportunities we can grab. I feel a bit like the jam and the sandwich in between the Treasury Minister and Health and Social Care Minister, but hopefully be able to answer any questions you've got in terms of painting a picture of where we're at and where we need to be over the next couple of years.
So just sort of by way of context, this time last year, the first of these government conferences, the economic strategy was in its infancy. So in that last 12 months, what progress do you think we've made?
Yeah, so thank you. I mean, this year is more about what we've achieved, what we've delivered. So last year's government conference, the first one, we launched the economic strategy, putting £100 million into investing in the people of the Isle of Man and the infrastructure we've got. What we'll be having tomorrow from the Department for Enterprise is some of the schemes that have been approved through the Infrastructure Investment Scheme, which is a way of using public money to leverage private investment, particularly in terms of residential accommodation and some of the mixed-use accommodations. We've also seen an increase in the active working population, the increase in the number of jobs people are doing, but we still have some of the key issues that we had last year, particularly in terms of workforce and skills and trying to attract people to the islands that we need to allow those businesses here to expand, but also to encourage more businesses to start up here. And also, since last year, the economic situation has become far more evident in terms of the costs, both in terms of COVID, but also dealing with some of the cost of living increases and the ongoing inflationary increases. So tomorrow morning when I give the presentation, it will be very much where we were, where we're at now. But we still have got a lot of work to do. What I would say with Treasury, after sitting watching Kwasi Kwarteng this time last year, is what I think the Isle of Man should do is bring people along with the changes, have measured changes that are gradual, and evolve our policies rather than doing some of the shock tactics that other jurisdictions have done and then have to pick up the pieces later. It's also quite evident that although we are an island with an independent government, we are completely not immune to some of the worldwide pressures that are faced, particularly in terms of energy costs, inflation, and the rising interest rates. And we're beginning to understand how that's affecting the community as a whole, but also how it's affecting individual people quite significantly.
Okay, so here we have the Treasury Minister ready for your questions. Budgets, taxation, spending, deficits, benefits, debts, international credit ratings, they are all his bag. So I have one Slido question here, but I always like to start with something from the floor. So the gentleman at the top. Okay.
Can I ask the Treasury Minister, previous ministers of Treasury actually engaged with the banks on the Isle of Man. Mm-hmm. We're struggling at the minute for some of the banks that are actually dealing with people that are wanting to come to the Isle of Man. Mm-hmm. Can I ask what Treasury is doing to talk to the banks and guide those individuals who want to base themselves in the Isle of Man and give them some support?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. So we have regular meetings with the Isle of Man Banking Association, representatives of all the major banks here, and certainly I relate to them some problems that either individuals or companies have had opening new accounts. We've also got the ridiculous situation with credit cards, for instance, whereby you have a high street bank, and as soon as you change your postcode, they want to take your credit card away from you because you're suddenly on the Isle of Man and suddenly something has changed. So we met, the Chief Minister and I met with the CEO of the Lloyds Group only last week to try to make sure they understood that to allow people to move here, whether it's for business or to live, we have to have a level playing field. When you look at the risk of people on the Isle of Man, it's incredibly low. I mean, people don't default on their mortgages. People don't suddenly not pay off their loans. We know where they are. They don't get very far. And when you look at defaulting in terms of loans, it's incredibly low compared with the UK. There are some differences in terms of our insolvency laws, and one of the Treasury jobs that we're going through at the moment is bringing those up to date. But certainly I talk to the banks on a regular basis to put that point forward, that we have to have them on board to attract people and to provide the same banking services here that they're used to in other jurisdictions. But also we work quite closely with the FSA to make sure that if there are barriers, regulatory barriers, that we break those down as well. Yes, you need to be careful about anti-money laundering and everything like that, but you also need to free up some of those banking institutions to be able to lend, to be able to provide new products, whether it's online or different products for the people who need it. So that those conversations are ongoing. Sometimes we are faced with financial decisions that banks make, whether it's closing a branch, for instance. I will ask them not to. I will ask them to make sure if they definitely want to close a branch, that they work with the local people, they work with the local communities, they give people options and other choices.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll move on to a Slido question here, which has been put in. It's anonymous, but the question is good. So what steps are you taking, Treasury Minister, to address the public sector pension fund deficit? And do you think a defined benefit scheme is sustainable?
Thank you very much, Sarah. What are Treasury doing? I think this is wider just than Treasury. What Treasury are doing at the moment is building into our financial forecasts that funding gap in between what's coming into the public sector pension and what needs to go out. There was policy decision several years ago in the previous administration not to keep on putting money into a fund, and so now it's coming out of general revenue, and we're talking to the order of 30 to 40 million pounds a year now that needs to come out. We are working with the PSPA to look at the cost envelope in terms of altering that, and we've also also started a DC scheme as an optional extra for those people who are joining or want to move from the DB scheme. In the previous administration, the decision was made not to close the DB scheme because of the knock-on effects that would have. We need the money coming into that, but there are issues when you've got a large number of retired people who were in the public sector, particularly sort of nurses, teachers, civil servants. The average public sector pension is around about £10,000 a year, but you do get some people who are claiming considerable pensions, and we need to balance that with new people coming in, paying more into their pensions, whether that's politicians. The judiciary have now joined the schemes as well. So we're trying to spread that out, but actually look at the overall costs and make sure that it is affordable in the long term. But again, one of the aspects I was just talking about, gradual change, particularly when you're talking about pensions, whether it be the state pension, private pensions, or the public sector pensions, you need to make changes very gradually, because these you're talking about long-term decisions, and sudden changes right at the start in terms of restricting the number of people coming into a scheme can have significant long-term effects in terms of the amount that's in that scheme to then pay out.
Okay, there was a gentleman who, that's the one, about 4 rows from the back. We'll have that, then we'll have some Slidos.
Michael Moyles, Minister, we know that the Manx pound and UK pound are at parity, but a Manx pound is not legal tender in the UK. The UK has a debt to GDP of over 100% now, and the Isle of Man, it's virtually a zero, or it should be around zero. Yeah. We also know that any country that has a fiat currency like the pound sterling, euro, or the US dollar, they devalue, well, they print money and effectively devalue their currency, which has very serious implications for inflation. Yeah. Now, do you think this is not the time for the Isle of Man to consider having an Isle of Man or a Manx currency which is not at parity? It may start at parity tomorrow, but due to the way we operate our finances, which I believe is far superior to the mismanagement of the UK, and if we don't look at this seriously, we will face problems which are not of our making.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're quite right in terms, I'd like to think our economic and fiscal policies are as good as they can get. With the Treasury Act, I'm not allowed to go into debt and have a negative budget. Yes, you can get around that by a degree of borrowing, bond issuance, things like that, but I cannot run the significant deficits that other jurisdictions do and other Treasury ministers can get away with. That causes problems in that if we're going to spend money, I have to raise it. And particularly at the moment, we are spending more money than we're raising, and that's why we've drawn down £152 million this financial year from reserves. We have a very close working relationship with the UK, not just in terms of currencies, and you're right, they are pegged, but in terms of, for instance, the VAT sharing, customs, overall, and also we're part of the common travel area. So I think if we were to separate out our currency and not have it pegged with the UK, it may cause issues. I also don't necessarily think that it would boost our credit rating when Moody's have looked at our economy because of its size and because of its heavy dependence, both politically and financially, with the UK. I think they'd always class us very, very similar to the UK. In the past, we have had a slight difference, but they've always classed us very similar because they know that what happens in the UK has knock-on effects with us anyway. In terms of printing more money, at the moment we've got about 30 million in the currency account. It would be lovely for me to print an extra couple of $100 million so that I could give it to health and social care. I think Laurie Hooper was here. Thank you. However, you're quite right that those jurisdictions that do that end up devaluing their entire economies. And in terms of money supply and some of those 70s and 80s financial policies, I don't think it's sensible. A time may come whereby, in terms of our close working relationship with the UK. That changes. At the moment, if any of you get an invitation to take part in the income survey and spending survey, which is part of FIRSA and the VAT sharing agreement, please take part. It's incredibly important for our finances. It brings in about 30% of government income through indirect taxation. If we were to separate out, we'd obviously have customs, we'd have financial controls and currency controls. And at the moment, we're trying to be very much part of the international community rather than go our own way. I think at the moment, it's not necessarily to our benefit to split from parity with the UK pound sterling. Whether that changes in the future, I don't know. But certainly at the moment, I think, as we were talking before, in terms of barriers to finance, if people wanted to buy a Manx pound and it would be 1.1 of a UK pound, that would be yet another barrier to trade, commerce, and tourism. And so, unless there was a very good reason for it, I wouldn't necessarily separate out our currencies in that way.
Very quick comeback.
Well, I just come back.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that we actually ditch the pound sterling, but because there is a lot of deposits held in the Isle of Man by financial institutions, if we had a currency which we call the Manx pound, which is pegged to something that was real, not a figment of people's imagination, it could well be very attractive to make our country a bit like Switzerland, where they hold euros, dollars, pounds, but you can also have Swiss francs. And here is an opportunity. Well, you can actually have a Manx pound and punt on that.
Yeah, and whether, that's one of the aspects of cryptocurrencies as well, and how they develop in terms of virtual currencies and virtual currencies that are run by national banks, and how you go forward with that. I think there are lots of possibilities there in how you develop currency and the way trade works in the future, and it may be that we find a better way of doing that. At the moment, it's I think it's to our benefit to have as few barriers as possible, but if opportunities arose, for instance, to have a slightly different fiscal policy, we could certainly explore that.
Some blue sky thinking there, thank you. I'm going to go to a Slido question now, which actually starts with a statement. Our National Insurance Fund is about 1 billion and is due to be exhausted by 2047. Yep. Here comes the question. With the proposed raid on the fund, when does the government actually think that the fund will be exhausted? I mean, do you accept the premise of the question?
Yeah. So every 5 years, one of the responsibilities of Treasury is to have an independent report on the National Insurance Fund, and we get GAD to do it. The government actuary department of HMRC, and they come in and look at the long-term viability of the fund. And what they've said is, if you do nothing, the fund will be extinguished by 2047-48, which is earlier than it would have done. And part of that is the drawdowns that were made during COVID of money from the fund to keep the economy going. Now, in the UK, there's a lot of conversation about the triple lock and the unsustainability of that long term. And I think we do need to address some of those problems. The National Insurance Fund is ring-fenced to pay for certain benefits, predominantly state pensions. Now, we've developed our own Manx state pension on the Isle of Man. At the moment, we have two main systems, three to be precise. So we have people before 2019 and people after 2019, and we're obliged to treat them equally and at the moment and try to pay them equally. But I think certainly on the run-up to the budget, if we are going to have a sustainable NI fund, we need to look at the long term, at the amount of money coming in and the amount of money going out. There are various ways of doing that, and we've seen what happened in France when the retirement age was raised. Actually, when GAD have looked at the present system, if you raise the retirement age more and more, actually the amount of extra money you get is negligible. And then you're dealing with an older workforce who will come to a time when they just can't work physically. So I don't think that's worthwhile. But I think we do need to look at the way we treat pensioners here to make sure that they maintain a good standard of living, but make sure that the pension pot that pays for it, the NI fund, one, it isn't plundered anymore and is maintained, that we have close guidance and governance around it, but also that we build in some long-term guarantees so it can continue. And that's one of the things that Treasury are working up at the moment, in line with the budget for next year.
Thank you. So this next question is from Ray Scott, who asks, does the Isle of Man expect to have to do anything about worldwide minimum tax on larger companies, and will the tax base be affected?
So yes, to both of them. One of the commitments made, not just by this administration but by previous administrations, is to comply with all the relevant international taxation agreements and standards. Why is that important? Because in the past we've seen the effect of blacklisting and the effect it's had on individual jurisdictions, which are part of an international marketplace, and the way that companies have pulled out, banks have pulled out, and their economies have suffered. And we've seen that recently with the assessments made by Moneyval. So in terms of the OECD pillars, a lot of them are looking at some of the big major multinational companies, particularly the data companies such as Meta, who have activities right the way through the world, but actually their taxation and where they pay tax is a little bit opaque, and bringing in those minimum standards. Pillar 2 will bring in a 15% minimum rate right across the globe, hopefully. I think there's 167 countries that have signed up to it. 15% on those large multinational companies with an annual turnover of over 750 million euros. Now, that will affect certain companies that are based on the Isle of Man. We do have some of the big e-gaming companies, we have some of the big banks and financial companies, and some of the big insurance companies who would be encompassed by the OECD rules. And so Treasury are in close negotiation, not just with the OECD, with the Treasury in the UK, but also Guernsey and Jersey. And we've made the commitment to move forward together on the international taxation rules, because as part of the economic strategy we launched last year, part of that was broadening out the tax base. We have a 0-10 corporate taxation rate on the Isle of Man. We're not aiming necessarily to deviate from that, but as the rest of the world starts charging perhaps slightly different rate for the large multinational companies, if they are here, it would make sense for us to take that tax take here rather than to go to another country. And so we need to work with those companies that are going to be impacted by these changes and make sure that they're aware and make sure we work with them.
Thank you. Here comes another one. So inheritance tax and capital gains tax are often seen as red lines for the Isle of Man, but this one addresses inheritance tax with this proposition. Many people move to the island when they retire and don't pay into the system as they're not economically active. Why not apply an inheritance tax on their estate to cover the burden, and that's the word used here, that they create?
Yeah, so we've got a taxation strategy which will be presented by the end of the year, and we've looked at some of the wealth taxes, and particularly talking capital gains and inheritance tax. And I think that the person who asked the question is right. In the past, people have retired here to avoid inheritance tax, and that's fine. But actually what we're trying to do as a government and really as a community is grow the active working population. So one of the aspects of the recent Tynwald Committee on Population Rebalancing was looking at how we attract economically active people here to contribute to our society, but also whether we introduce disincentives for people who just want to come here to live and avoid taxation in other countries. And I think that is a complicated debate, because there are lots of people who have an affinity with the Isle of Man. They've grown up here, they've ended up working abroad, and they want to retire here, or people whose children perhaps have moved here who want to come and join them in their later years. So I think we need to be quite careful how we do that. Certainly, one of the key parts of our fiscal policy has to be fairness, and I think it wouldn't necessarily be fair to have a completely different tax for you if you were elderly and if you happen to come from another jurisdiction. What we do need to look at, though, in terms of healthcare funding, is if people come to the Isle of Man and they're not going to work, they're not going to necessarily contribute national insurance and taxation to keep the healthcare system going, is there another charge that should be levied so that they contribute to some of the services that they may end up using. And there's lots of countries in the world where, for instance, Australia, if you emigrate to Australia, whatever age you are, there is a health bond there that you have to put into, so that if you need to draw down on that, that extra capital is available to the health and social care system. We have already some barriers. So if you move to the Isle of Man and you suddenly something happens to you, you have a stroke or something like that, and you need social care, if you need to go into a nursing or residential home, the fact that you haven't been resident here for 10 years means that that's not paid by the state. So there are already some barriers here that people aren't aware of, but we perhaps need to be a little bit more explicit, particularly if different countries start ramping up some of their wealth taxes and there's more elderly people coming over here. I've got nothing against old people, don't get me wrong. Some of my best friends are getting old. However, we need to make sure that we balance our population. I think in the past we have appealed to a different demographic, and we are now seeing the consequences of that with an elderly population, and trying to fund the services that they both need and deserve.
Any questions from the floor? Yes, so there's one here. Please, Tess, third row down.
Thank you very much, Minister. And my question goes back to the banking question at the beginning. And the vast majority of the banks on the Isle of Man all are some of the worst in the world for investing in fossil fuels. And for many of us, there is no alternative. Is there efforts by the government to attract alternative, ethical and sustainable banking to the Isle of Man? Thank you very much.
Yes. So there's a couple of aspects of that. I mean, one is, I think, ethical investment used to be a niche thing. I think it's now business as usual, and part of that is the ability for shareholders and campaign groups to put significant pressure on banks, where and particularly at the moment, a lot of that's been centred on Barclays, for instance, and some of their investments in particularly Shell and BP. Now, from a government perspective, that does affect us in terms of our investment strategy and making sure that we have very strict ESG policies from word go in terms of where we put our own investments and who we get that to invest for us. I think going forward, certainly the FSA are looking far more at trying to attract different products, as I was saying, onto the Isle of Man. And so trying to, one, make sure that people are given the choice. And for instance, banks like Lloyd's have various products which are far better in terms of ethical investment. They don't necessarily cut out certain companies because they're a previous involvement in fossil fuels, because, yes, we could argue for ages about greenwashing, but we know that some of the major investments from BP Lightsource, for instance, in terms of renewables, come from that company. But certainly the FSA are looking at how we can open up different licenses for different companies to produce different products, but also how we can, and I think the important thing is how consumers who use those banks know that what they're getting is what they're being told. So it's that integrity and that check that if you say you are investing ethically for somebody, that you actually do it, and holding people to account for that. And so certainly the FSA are doing quite a lot of work in terms of that, because one, it's the right thing to do, but two, there are marketing opportunities there that if we can, because a lot of companies on the Isle of Man want renewable energy, they want the ability to recycle, they want the ability to invest ethically because their shareholders tell them to. And if we can't provide that on the Isle of Man, then they'll go elsewhere because lots of other jurisdictions are doing it. So to be honest, it's good for business as well as being the right thing to do ethically.
So you're confirming that there is demand?
Yes.
Demand from that lady?
No,
is wider
absolutely.
demand.
There's demand from individual consumers and demand from companies that they want to put their money where they know it's going to be invested ethically, and then that leads back to government that when we invest our reserves, that we need to do that as well. Now, there's been several Tynwald questions about the proportion of our overall investments that are related to fossil fuel companies, but also gambling companies, companies to do with linked with tobacco or alcohol or armaments. and that amount is very small. I think the last count we did in 2019 was around about 6%, but it's still 6%. Now, we need, as we develop our ESG policies in terms of how government invest your money as taxpayers, because we are the custodians of your money, how we invest that, we need to be absolutely certain that it's going in those right areas.
Okay, I have a Slido question for you now. We seem to have an awful lot of strategies without any form of funding forthcoming from Treasury. Departments appear not to be in control of their ability to progress their strategies, and the Island Plan is bursting with strategies, isn't it? With the ability to progress it resting with Treasury. So are you not funding these strategies?
Yeah, so, that's a fantastic question. Thank you very much, David Catlow, if he put it on, because that is what, from a Treasury perspective, absolutely, there's that frustration that Tim Wald will vote for strategies and it looks absolutely brilliant, but nobody actually calculates how much it's going to cost, and more importantly, where that money is going to come from. And is that reprioritising something you're doing, or is it creating something else that needs to be afforded, and therefore where's that money going to come from? And we've got some of the key ones. The childcare strategy, that's costed at probably around about £10 million if you wanted to do it properly right across the piece. So education receives £133 million this year in terms of their total budget. Where's that £10 million going to come from? Because taxing working people to generate the revenue is self-destructive after a while, and people aren't going to come here if they're taxed far more here than any other jurisdiction, and it's slightly more expensive to live on the island. So I think that's absolutely right. Funnily enough, we had a council ministers meeting this week that went through a list of all the strategies that have been published and are still active, and sort of said, right, where's the money going to come from? How do they interrelate? And some of those are relatively small amounts. The suicide prevention strategy needs money. The childcare strategy needs money. The economic strategy needs money, and so Treasury's job is to balance those, but also, unfortunately, sometimes to say no, to someone say it's a great strategy, but if you can't look at prioritising that, if you can't show how that's more important than paying nurses, or more important than building a new school, or more important than fixing potholes, we're going to have problems there. And it's that fiscal responsibility for some of the departments that come forward with strategies to actually say where they're going to get money from. It gets more complicated when you get a strategy that links several departments, or is right the way across government, and everyone says it's a great idea, but when you say who's going to pay for it, everyone goes a bit quiet. And that's where Treasury comes in, really, to try to prioritise the spending and look at whether we need to raise new revenue to do it, or whether we can use the existing revenue in a more imaginative way.
So it's about prioritisation, political priority.
Yeah, I think it has to be, and I think sometimes I'm going to have to be the antichrist to the man from Del Monte and actually, stand up and say no. Unless, because it. The Island Plan, a lot of that actually is funded, and funds have been found. However, a lot of those funds have been drawn down from reserves, and in the course of the next 5 years, we're going to be drawing down around just over £300 million for reserves to pay for some of these strategies, to grow the economy and to return to a balanced budget. If we keep on adding more and more demand onto that without necessarily raising the extra revenue, we will not accomplish what we need to do, which is to get back to a balanced budget and get back to a situation where we can start paying money back into those reserves that were taken down during 2020 and 2021.
Okay, got another question here on screen. By what percentage do we need to raise tax revenue in order to fund Manx Care, in order to deliver its mandate?
So the funding of health and social care needs to be very, very carefully calculated. We've got the CEO of Manx Care here, so I'll be quite honest that I think with health and social care, and with any healthcare system around the world, you could throw money at it and it would just absorb it. There's a never-ending need in terms of medicine to do more things to more people, with more drugs, with more technologies, with more different operations, but particularly different ways of treating diseases that actually never existed when I was in medical school. So we need some controls over that expenditure, again, to prioritise it so that it helps those people most that need, and also delivers good health care, but also delivers value for people who pay into that. So that's a difficult balance. The whole reason for Manx Care to be set up following this Jonathan Michaels report was to justify the budget, to delineate what was necessary to provide the healthcare service that we wanted, but also to be brutally honest in terms of what healthcare service we could afford. And I think there's a huge amount of work being done at Manx Care to develop that. In terms of increasing funding, I think when we delivered the budget in February, we were quite clear that there is a growing funding gap that needs to be met between the amount of money that goes into healthcare and the amount they need. You can't just peg it to inflation because healthcare costs always exceed inflation, and that's without some major pandemic or some major extra expenditure that needs to be met. And certainly Manx Care have had to deal with spiralling costs, particularly in terms of off-island bills from the UK NHS treating patients from the Isle of Man where we can't treat them because we don't have cardiac catheterization labs, we don't have brain surgery here because we're too small a jurisdiction, so we'll always need to send people across for treatments, some of which are incredibly expensive, but it's the right thing to do because it's the right outcome for them. So in terms of how much do we need to put taxation up, I cannot give a figure for that because it's not just a one-off cost, it's an ongoing cost, and what we need to do is work with the Department of Health and Social Care and Manx Care to make sure that they're delivering value for money, but make sure they've got enough resources to do that effectively. So I'm fudging that question, but all will be revealed in February's budget.